You probably know by now that Space Godzilla is the leading candidate in the race for what most people tend to think will be the pivotal role as a massive threat to Godzilla and Kong and all of the monsterverse in Supernova. And if Space Godzilla is actually in Supernova, I might just have found some ways in which Godzilla's evil clone of sorts can be introduced to this franchise, thanks to 2 cancelled Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla films that were pitched to Toho before they eventually decided to go with Godzilla vs. Destroyer so that the Heisei era could come to an end. With all the hints we've gotten so far for Supernova, it's actually kinda wild how close these cancelled films align with those clues. And with Toho and -1 reigniting the classic Godzilla fanbase, now's a great time to retread down memory lane and use what's come in the past to help predict the future. Everyone, welcome to Dangerville, this is Jacob, and let's get to it. After Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla released in 1994, the future of the Godzilla franchise had once again come into question. Continue this era of movies or round it all up in one epic conclusion. During this time, Yasuki Nakano, a writer, director, and overall assistant to Toho at that time, came up with, allegedly, 3 separate pitches for what would have been a direct sequel to Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla. Big shout out to the Toho Kingdom for sourcing all of this information together, by the way. Out of these 3 alleged drafts, only 2 of them have surfaced, at least from what I could find. These are what would have been movies called Revenge of SpaceGodzilla and Terror of SpaceGodzilla. Not very original names in the franchise, but you can get the idea of what Yasuki was aiming for. A clear and direct follow-up to the ending of Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla, in which SpaceGodzilla lost that battle but now was going to come back and get his redemption against Godzilla and Earth. Both of these cancelled stories and the information we have on their plots could easily be used for the Monsterverse and Supernova, so let's break down what we know about them, starting with Revenge of SpaceGodzilla. The actual full title that this movie was working with around that time would have been Revenge of SpaceGodzilla Grown Up Little vs. SpaceGodzilla-ified Godzilla, which already tells you pretty much the basic idea of this story pitched to Toho. Immediately following Godzilla's victory over SpaceGodzilla, the story would have gone in a bad direction, even though victory seemed evident for the King of the Monsters. Not so fast, I guess. And as the title implied, it would have had a grown-up little Godzilla take on a mutated version of Godzilla who took on a lot of Space Godzilla's essence. You know, Godzilla got Space Godzilla-ified. Big thanks to the artist San Goh for letting me use his fantastic 3D interpretation of a monsterverse Space Godzilla here. Feel free to check out his ArtStation and Instagram if you want to check out more kick-ass monster designs. They're real good. The story for Revenge of SpaceGodzilla was pitched to go like this. Godzilla had won the battle, but during it, he had unwillingly absorbed too much of SpaceGodzilla's crystal cells. All of this foreign DNA rushing into his body would cause him to suffer horribly due to these cellular chain reactions going on within him. He would grow abnormalities all over his body, and his entire attitude would change, making him go berserk and rabid, almost like he had rabies or like he was infected with a parasite that was taking over his body. Completely losing touch with his old self, Godzilla would begin to attack the entire world. Once again, the giant crystals would play a big role in this conquest. So in a sense, this Space Godzilla-ified Godzilla was just Space Godzilla 2.0. In this time, little Godzilla continued to grow and would have hit adulthood, over 50 meters tall and ready to fight. The now not-so-little Godzilla would take on his prior role model and worst nightmare in a rematch that would have been impactful, but if I had to be blunt about it, it really would have been pretty much the exact same story as Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla, minus the little Godzilla story arc in that first film where SpaceGodzilla was trying to steal him. This whole idea could have gone over decently though if they really hit it home with the emotions that would come with little Godzilla becoming an adult and avenging his parental figure, while also having to kill this same individual who was now unwillingly taken over from an evil life form. It's definitely a little deep sounding, right? But ultimately, this wasn't the leading option of the 3 alleged pitches to Toho. So let's move on to the idea that would have been the selection for the sequel to Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla if it was greenlit into production. Terror of SpaceGodzilla. In Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla, we got a tease of what space combat would look like with a kaiju. When Mogera took on SpaceGodzilla in space, it ignited something in Yasuki. Allegedly, he wanted to make the scene much longer originally and have a lot more to it, but ultimately the scene was cut down to fit into the rest of the story and get to the main event, which was Godzilla himself versus this invader. But Yasuki created a bunch of storyboards for scenes that weren't included in the space battle, and he really wanted to have another go at them if the the sequel was made. It seemed like he really wanted to deliver on that climactic space battle with the monster. But this time, this monster wasn't going to be Space Godzilla or really even a traditional kaiju. The idea Yasuki had was a lot more crazy than that for Terror of Space Godzilla. The story would have revolved around this. The body of Space Godzilla on the surface of Earth had been destroyed, but back in space, a fragment of his body, his DNA, remained. Likely the fallout from damage he sustained with his space battle with Mogera. Already forming from insane circumstances himself, this fragment of Space Godzilla once again played God. This hunk of space G would fuse with an orbital space station and then rapidly grow and morph into something new. A giant crystalline monster several kilometers or miles in size. Instead of landing on the surface of the planet, this Space Godzilla satellite would lay waste to the planet below using otherworldly powers. Powerful electromagnetic waves, an array of gravitational anomalies, and turning matter itself into crystals. Earth was under attack from something Godzilla finally couldn't help with. On the ground, Godzilla and Little Godzilla would have done all they could to combat the threat from beyond Earth's atmosphere, but what could they do except fire blindly into space with atomic blasts that likely would drain Godzilla of most of his power? This would have been a battle where humanity would have done most of the dirty work. Yosuke intended the humans of the story to make a new Mogera, but this time bigger, faster, and stronger, specifically built to fight this new satellite-like monster in space. In the end, it sounds like Godzilla might have sacrificed himself to help in this battle, maybe unleashing so much energy from below that it drained the life out of him. But ultimately, this Space Godzilla mothership of sorts would have went down. Maybe with Godzilla even, and Space Godzilla would have finally come to an end. Alas, neither of these pitches were selected by Toho, and they decided to go with Godzilla vs. Destroya. But let's talk about how these cancelled films could possibly come to fruition in Godzilla x Kong Supernova. First off, we've already made a theory on how Godzilla could absorb too much power and become a power-hungry evil version of his past self, which then, combined with all the space hints and clues the cast and crew have thrown out for Supernova, really aligns with the story of Revenge of Space Godzilla. To see Godzilla taken over, making him the bad guy. I don't want to necessarily see this outcome, but you can't deny that it oddly aligns with what we know about the next MonsterVerse movie. And with Terror of Space Godzilla, we already know that mechs and crazy kaiju fighting technology are being utilized in the MonsterVerse. It's just kind of crazy how the major plot points for both of these cancelled ideas could be revamped for the MonsterVerse, and as of right now, like I said, just oddly fits right in place with where it seems like the franchise is headed. But what do you guys think? Just remember everyone, this is purely speculation and just a bit of fun. Nothing is confirmed still, so we just have to wait and see how it goes. And if you're excited for the next MonsterVerse movie or the sequel to Godzilla -1 and you haven't subscribed to Dangerville already, what are you waiting for? Let's talk about Godzilla and some monsters, everyone. I'll see you in the next one.